am so excited to get this video out to everyone. I have been getting so many requests on a video for a fully smocked bodice dress. And of course, this technique will work for any bodice dress pattern, but I am using the Children's Corner Jamie pattern, View C. And as always, all of the information, the materials that I've used, all of that will be in the description box below. So to begin, I cut out 2 back pattern pieces for the bodice on the fold, and I assemble mine a little bit differently than the pattern calls for, and I line up the lap part on the fold of the fabric. So basically I'm omitting that facing section. Then I cut out 2 sleeve pieces and finally 1 bodice front piece. Now I am making a dress and not a bubble, so if you are making the bubble, go ahead and cut out the front and back pieces for the bubble as shown in the pattern. And you can use the timestamps in the description box to skip ahead to where I actually start the construction. But if you're turning this into a dress as well, then you'll cut out 1 rectangle for the front and another for the back as I'm showing. Now the rectangle for the front will be as long as you desire. You know, keep in mind to allot some of that length for a hem treatment, whether that be a deep hem, you know, a laced hem treatment, or if you're just using the selvage edge, whatever you're deciding to do, allot that into the overall length. Then the back rectangle will be the same length as the front rectangle minus the back pattern piece, and that's why you see me holding up the back pattern piece to my fabric so I can see how long to make the back rectangle. And so the width of both of these rectangles will depend on the size you're making, the fabric that you're using, and the look that you're going for. So you can play it safe by making things wider than you think you need and then cutting off those pleats later. And you'll see what I mean as the video continues. But generally, a safe width would be about 3 times or maybe 3.5 times. That should be plenty unless you're doing like picture smocking. Of course, that depends on what fabric you're using as well. But overall, if you're using some sort of an heirloom fabric or a lightweight cotton, I think about 3 times the width that you're going to need would be safe. So finally, you'll want to cut some bias strips. I cut these into 2-inch wide and plenty long. I don't worry about the length. It's just one less thing to think about, and I'll cut it off later. Alright, now that you have all the pieces cut out, take the front rectangle piece, or your front bubble piece, if you're making the bubble, to your pleater. I'm adjusting how many needles I like to use and then rolling my fabric up on my wooden dowel after a really good ironing. Then I'm just pleating up the fabric, just taking my time, being careful not to tug on the fabric as it goes through the pleater. Just let your pleater do this work. Then I pick a few pleats out on each side and tie one side all the way down, tying those threads into groups of 2s or 3s. Then I adjust the pleats so they're a smidgen wider than my front pattern piece, and this gives me a little bit of wiggle room, and you'll see what I mean later on. So I'm using the grid on this blocking board to measure the width, but you could easily just use a tape measure as well if you don't have a blocking board. So once you get the width correct, then you can tie off the other side of threads in groups of 2s or 3s. Now, if you see my other videos, you know that I love to do all my smocking and handwork at the very end whenever possible. Well, that's not possible in this case. You will need to do your smocking at this point since you'll be cutting off those pleating threads as you construct your garment. And if you haven't done the smocking, you'll be out of luck with your pleats. It'll be a hot mess and it'll be extremely hard to recover from. So once your smocking is complete, take some freezer paper and cut the shape of the front of your bodice out using the pattern piece. Then you'll line up the freezer paper on the center of your smocking, and that's why I like to have a little bit of wiggle room on each side. It's just a little nice to have. Make sure you have that glossy side of the freezer paper touching your fabric and then iron it down. And you'll let this sit for a few minutes to cool. And then you'll have this stiff assembly that you can take to your machine and go around the perimeter using a tiny zigzag. Well, you'll go around the entire perimeter except for the bottom. You won't, obviously zigzag that onto your fabric. So you can take your zigzag just to the outside of your freezer paper, or you can stitch right on top of the freezer paper. It doesn't really make that big of a difference size-wise. It is slightly easier to get the paper off if it hasn't been stitched through though, but either way will work, so don't sweat it. Then I cut the shoulders in preparation to sew the shoulder seams. I take the back pieces and sew one to each shoulder. Then I sew the front lining piece to the shoulder seams of the back pieces. So basically you'll have one big circle, you'll have your front smock piece, then a back piece, then the front lining piece, and then finally the other back piece. You can fold the back pieces down the center and then put your front lining touching the back of your smocking piece and give that an ironing. And I like to pin at the shoulder seams to keep everything lined up. And I will say at this point it would be a good idea to finish the bottom area of that front lining piece. I didn't do this, but I wish I had. I would just turn it under twice and sew along, just kind of give it a little hem, if you will, and this will give you a clean look in the inside of your garment without you having to sew the lining to your smock section. You're not going to want to do that. It'll kind of show in your pleats and stuff. So just give it a little bit of a hem and move on with life. But anywho, I took that 2-inch wide bias strip, folded it in half lengthwise, and gave it an ironing so I could sew it onto the neckline of the garment. I haven't cut out the neckline yet, but I'm just following around the freezer paper, and again, there's no harm if you sew through the paper. I tend to prefer to sew through the paper, although it does mean you have to be a little careful as you remove the paper. Just give it a gentle tear and it should come away just fine. And then you can remove the small bit of paper on the other side of the seam. Now if something does happen and a few stitches are ripped out, when you tear the paper away, just go over that spot again with your machine to secure everything back down. It's not a big deal. Then I cut around the neckline. I also cut the ends of that bias band off to about a 1/2 inch or so away from the back of the dress. Now my goal whenever cutting around a neckline with a bias band like this is to cut just enough material that when I fold the bias band over, it touches, it just meets those machine stitches. And the idea is later on I'll use those machine stitches to hand sew that bias band down. And cutting off just enough of that fabric means that there's still fabric inside, kind of giving that bias band a little poof out so it doesn't look flat and rippled. And I have a video that goes into more details on how to make pretty necklines that I will link below. So then it's on to attaching those sleeves. First, I sew a bias stitch around the armhole so the lining and the garment fabric are locked together and I don't have to worry about them when I sew the sleeves on. You'll want to gather the top and bottom of the sleeves between those little clip marks. I use clip marks to show where those notches are on the, those little triangles on your pattern. And I always gather using 2 rows of stitches, one on each side of where your permanent stitches will go. It just makes your gathers look so much neater. So I'll gather the top of the sleeve a bit and then pin one side of the sleeve to the one side of the garment and then the other side of the sleeve to the other side of the garment, and then I'll pin the top of the sleeve to the shoulder seam, and then I just kind of adjust in between those pins to get the length correct. Then I take that to my machine and sew around the armhole curve. Once I finish that seam up, I remove the freezer paper and trim around the armhole curve and tidy up that seam. Then I finish by using a zigzag to enclose the raw edges. At this point, your smocking is all attached with secure seams and you can remove those pleating threads, which is like, oh, happy day. It's so exciting. I don't know. I just get excited about that stuff. Anywho, okay now. Then I took 2 more bias bands, and again, these are 2 inches wide, and the length of whatever the circumference of your child's arm is, plus about 1 inch or 2 for seam allowance and a little bit of movement. Again, I folded this band in half lengthwise and gave it an ironing. I adjusted the gathers at the bottom of the sleeve until they matched the length of the bias band, and then I sewed the 2 together. Then I trimmed up the seam with the same idea in mind with the neckline. I want just to fold the band over and be able to use the machine stitches to sew the band down by hand later on. Then I used the continuous placket method to put a placket in the back of the dress, but I would have done the same exact thing if I was making the bubble version too, and I have a video on how to do this method that I will link below. Then I put 2 rows of gather stitches on each side of the back piece. So be mindful on how you turn your placket sections when you're doing your gathers. So remember, like for girls, the right side closes over the left side, and the reverse is true for boys. So now I'm just matching the back skirt to the back bodice section, sewing those 2 together. You can see that I'm starting at the center of the back bodice sections, and you can know where your center is by that iron crease that's in there. So once each side is sewn, give that an ironing, and then you can turn to the inside of the garment and fold over the lining section to the back bodice. I'll sew this down by hand later on, and that'll enclose the raw edges of that seam. Then I gave the bottom of the sleeve band an ironing and made sure those bias strips was folded over on the inside of the sleeve as I pinned the sleeve together. Of course, you are more than welcome to do your hand sewing now if you think that's easier, but I just like to make sure the edges are folded over, and I'll do it later. You know, sitting on the couch, kind of like I just get it all done at once. So then I sew the sides together using French seams, and I have a detailed video on how to do this that I will link below. And at this point, that's all the similarities that the dress and the bubble share in the construction piece. So if you're making the bubble, again, I will link a video that you can pick up the instructions on how to finish the crotch area and those leg holes. If you are making the dress, however, you can hem it however you like, whether that's a deep hem, which is always a good favorite of mine, a pretty lace treatment, or just leave the selvage edge, which is actually what I'm doing in this case. I find that when you work with really pretty fabric, often the selvage edge is something to admire from time to time, so I like to show it off. But anywho, that's of course completely up to you. It is sewing, you do you. I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below and I will do my best to answer them. As always, I appreciate y'all for watching and I hope to catch y'all next time.